Hello and welcome to the Texas Tribune TribCast for Tuesday, January 13th. I'm Eleanor law and politics reporter, joined as always by editor-in-chief Matthew Watkins.
Hello
How's
there.
it going?
It's going well.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're talking about my favorite topic.
Yes. Well, I was going to say, one of the great joys of being a Texas politics reporter is even-numbered years, where
Yes.
you get to watch your colleagues across the country go back to their state capitals and cover legislative sessions,
Mhm.
and we get to just, totally check out, basically take a year off. Nobody's
Mhm.
talking about anything interesting. Nobody's really getting that into politics at all,
Yeah,
frankly.
absolutely.
No, if only that was the case. Our beloved elected officials are giving us no time off. Obviously, we have the 2026 primary election in like 35 minutes from now. And it's becoming increasingly clear what the main topic for the 2026 election and obviously the 2027 legislative session is going to be. And it is
Property taxes.
property taxes.
Woo!
Which, just already we've got our elected officials at each other's throats about this.
And I would just like to note that I have no idea what that drum roll sounded like to our podcast
Yeah, I realized
listeners.
belatedly that's probably the worst thing you can do, other than like chew gum while doing this. So sorry about that. This is going to be just a very, very important topic that's we're already getting very in the weeds, like shockingly in the weeds, considering we are a year out from the next legislative session, to talk about the different proposals that our different lawmakers are talking about and why this issue just continues to be such a hot topic in Texas. We are joined by John Diamond, the Senior Director of the Center for Tax and Budget Policy at the Baker Institute. John, thanks for being here.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. For all we talk about property taxes and that our statewide elected officials talk about property taxes, Texas does not actually have a statewide property tax. We have local taxes set by cities, counties, and school districts that pay for a wide range of services that many other states choose to cover with income tax, which we obviously don't have. John, maybe you can sort of give us a little bit of the lay of the land on where things stand now, before we get into all the where people want things to go. This has been a big hot button issue in the legislature for a couple of sessions now. What property taxes do people in Texas have to pay, and sort of what are some of where have those recent fights taken us in terms of progress on that?
So you mentioned, there's property taxes. Cities have them, counties have them, school districts have them, and we have these strange entities called the special districts, which include flood districts and many other smaller groups that impose a property tax on Texas residents. There's been a lot of changes since 2015. So we've had reforms in 2015, 2019, 2023, and 2025 that have all aimed to reduce the bite of the property tax on Texas homeowners and businesses. It's done very little to lighten the voter disapproval of the amount that they have to pay in property taxes. And that's mostly because home values over that period have gone up substantially, have gone up faster than median incomes. And I think that's put a squeeze on the taxpayer budget, while counties, school districts, and other government entities also complain about their budgets.
One of my favorite things to sort of say about property taxes is that they were perfectly designed to make people angry, right? When your sales tax bill goes up, I know you don't get a sales tax bill, but when the amount you're paying in sales tax goes up, it's because you're buying more things, which is fun, and you get some stuff out of it, right? If your federal income tax goes up, it's probably because you've gotten a raise, right? And you, again, you might not feel it and you might associate it with a good thing, right? But your property tax payments can go up without you doing anything or realizing any immediate benefit, right? You buy a house, the value of your house goes up. That's good, right? It raises your net worth and all that, but it's a benefit that you can't realize until you probably sell the house, or I guess maybe like take a loan out on the house or any of those types of things, right? But your taxes already go up. And that's just an incredibly frustrating thing to experience. You're like, I didn't do anything here, but my tax bill went up. And like that to me is like the reason why basically we're in this world right now where we can talk about what Greg Abbott wants to do here in a minute, but basically politicians are asked every year, no matter what they did the previous session, what are you going to do about my property taxes? Because that frustrating growth continues to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious. Like John, you mentioned, like since 2015, we've seen a lot of these reforms. I think for a while before that, there were people calling for property tax reforms. It did not have as much political salience as it does now. No one is ever happy when they get their tax bill. What changed that made things start moving on this? That made this an actual have some more political pressure behind it.
Again, I'll go back to the rise in housing values and how much faster housing values were rising than income. And so, that yearly hit so when housing prices go up, you kind of double whammy in that if you move to a new house, you have to pay more for your mortgage. And then on top of that, we were in a very low interest rate period. So houses were very cheap in terms of the monthly payment. But then starting in 2017, interest rates started to creep up. And then they after COVID, they ramped up fairly quickly. And that made owning a house even more expensive. So all of the additional cost added to this yearly property tax payment that was going up rapidly and faster than people felt they could afford, even though during that period, the state government kept saying, we're going to solve this problem. We're going to compress the school tax rate by 10 cents. We're going to raise your property tax exemption from 15,000 to 25,000 to 40,000 to 100,000. But taxpayers continued to feel the pressure of higher property tax payments, even though the state government was telling them, we're acting, we are going to solve this problem. We're going to bring these taxes down. But they've been relatively ineffective. I mean, they have brought them down some, but the increase in house prices have just eaten away at that over that same time period.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're hearing now from some sort of loudest voices is, eliminate property taxes, right? I mean, a little bit more rhetoric around like you're basically paying the government rent to live on your private property. I feel like there's a little bit more of a hardened ideology forming around this that, property taxes are, theft or, theft from the government. And is there a world in which we're going to go through again the specifics of the plan for like, here's how we could pull some of this back. Can Texas eliminate property taxes? Like, what would happen if we just were like, we're done allowing anyone to tax your property?
So I've written 2 papers on this. So I will run a total repeal of property taxes. So if we were to eliminate property taxes and replace them with an increase in the sales tax rate, but no other change. So we don't broaden the base. We don't reduce expenditures. It's just a swap, sales tax for property tax. And the results I got were that you would need about a 22% rate, assuming that there's no evasion of the higher sales tax rate. But we know from the literature that if you raise the sales tax rate to 22%, people are going to avoid and evade that tax. And so if you just build in a very modest amount, say 10% of evasion of the sales tax, the rate would need to go to 26%. And so that is to replace the roughly 80 billion in property taxes that are collected at all levels, city, county, school district, and special purpose districts. I wrote another paper in, I think it was around 2017, it may have been 2018, that looked at just replacing the O&M portion of the school tax. So this is roughly $40 billion. And in that paper, I allowed the sales tax base to be expanded. I think I took it from about 60% of goods were taxed to right around 70, leaving a bunch of the most, controversial or the most desired goods that people want to be untaxed, like food and so forth, leaving those untaxed and just expanding to things like services and that kind of thing. And that raised the sales tax base to about 70% of total final sales. And then I reduced expenditure by a small amount each year. And in that paper, I estimated that you would need to raise the sales tax just to get rid or just to eliminate the school tax, the operations and maintenance tax, by about, you'd have to raise it to about 9.7%. So it's about a percentage point and a half. That is actually doable, whereas complete elimination of school district taxes as well as city, county, and special purpose districts, raising the rate to 22 or 26% is not feasible. I mean, economically, that would not work out well. The inefficiencies in that system would be much larger than the inefficiencies in the current with a property tax system. And so I think that's where we are. So is it reasonable to think in other states, and we actually know this is true. So if you look at a state like Michigan, and lots of other states actually, they don't fund schools locally through property taxes. So we could easily fund our education system at the state level and carve out, or get rid or eliminate the property taxes for school districts at a local level. Although you would still leave property taxes to finance long-term debt. So things like building school buildings or sports stadium, their football stadiums or whatever, those could still be financed by property taxes at the local level. I will point out that, one of the problems with replacing all property taxes is on the back end. So once you replaced the taxes, let's say we replaced all property taxes with the sales tax, we raise the rate to 26%. The state then has to allocate that money. And how do you allocate that money between cities, counties, special purpose districts, and school districts? That's a very complicated formula. It's one California has had to deal with post Prop 13 in 1978. And what they do, the way they do it, when you actually look at it and look at the data, is pretty strikingly bad. Like it's something we definitely want to avoid. So I will stop there.
Well, I mean,
but yes, it is possible in some sense, but not in a total sense.
right. I mean, I think you eventually have to pay for some government services, right? Like the money has to come from somewhere. And to your point, yes, I mean, I think sales tax is more appealing in that, like, well, you're at least getting something. But a 25, 30% sales tax increase, I think would, I don't know that people would love that.
No, probably not. And I mean, it's worth noting that in 2019, I might be getting the date wrong, so you can correct me if I am, the big three at the time, Speaker Bonin, I believe, and then Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick and Governor Greg Abbott proposed increasing the sales tax by 1 cent essentially, in an effort to buy down property taxes. They did this late in the session after there was a big push to reduce property taxes, and it quickly generated major pushback and ended up failed. So if they can't get a 1% increase, a 1 cent increase, can you do a 22 cent, sales tax? I would be highly skeptical of that. The other thing that I think is worth noting here is that sales tax is also a very regressive tax, right? And poorer people pay a higher proportion of their incomes towards sales taxes than they do, other kinds of taxes. Um, whether that would be a concern of state lawmakers or not is hard to say, but another possible drawback from doing that.
And like, I mean, just when we think about, I mean, I rent my apartment. I understand that there, in the long run, people say like property tax reform does eventually help renters, all of that. But at the end of the day, if I'm, I don't have to pay a property tax bill every year, but if I have to pay 22% more every time I go to the grocery store, that's sort of more persistent annoyance, which obviously, as we're saying, sort of a non-starter. But I think um, for the people who are saying, abolish property tax, not anything less is unacceptable. I haven't heard a ton of sort of sitting with the reality of what that might look like.
John, I
You
want to
would
ask you. Oh,
definitely need another revenue source.
Right.
I mean, you would definitely need to replace at least a large portion of the revenue. So maybe there would be some spending cuts that could offset some.
for sure.
But another problem with the sales tax that doesn't often get attention is that about 40%, 40 to 50% of the sales tax base is on business purchases. And so, as economists, we call that a cascading tax. And those are not very efficient taxes. And so the sales tax system does have its warts. And that makes it actually hard to raise the rate too much more than where we have it. I think you could go to around 10%. Although I agree with Matt, politically, that's a much bigger lift than it is economically. But I think that's where you're capped. Anything over 10%, and there's going to be some major inefficiencies that creep into the system more so than we currently have. And so, my view is that you really would need to replace, if you really wanted to eliminate property taxes, you would need to replace the sales tax with a more efficient version of a consumption tax.
John, I want to ask. You talked about how if you get rid of property taxes, you have to replace it. I mean, for the last, let's say, 7 or 8 years, the state has essentially been able to lower property taxes for free. It's not for free, of course, because we're spending money on it. But economic growth in Texas has been so significant that they have had the surplus revenue largely from sales tax, increased spending, and maybe some inflation that is driving increased sales tax revenues as well. That they've been able to take money from the sales tax pool and use it to buy down property taxes, specifically in schools. The number that was sort of reported by the Legislative Budget Board last year was the state has essentially committed in recent sessions $51 billion in order to do this. I think there are a lot of people asking the question of like, is that era of sort of free property tax reduction still possible given where we might be economically, right? And that the sales tax revenues, other revenues in the state might be stagnant or even down next year in 2027. It might be very hard to even continue paying for the cuts that we did these past few sessions, let alone significantly reduce school property taxes, or as Governor Abbott is asking, completely get rid of them. I wonder if you could just sort of reflect on that situation for me. Do you feel like the way I've framed it is accurate? How does that factor into these conversations, do you think, going forward?
I think you framed it pretty well. So, starting in around 20, it was a little before 2017, we started to see an increase in sales taxes This was partly due to the way that we treat online sales.
Hmm.
And that actually led to a significant increase in sales tax revenues by taxing anyone that sells goods online that has a nexus in Texas. Uh, and so we've seen this surplus of revenues, both because of higher sales tax revenues, as well as the other big revenue increase. It wasn't a revenue, well, it's a money increase in Texas was the large expansion in fiscal help from the federal government. And
Uh-huh.
so
Right.
when you look at Texas's budget, about a third of it comes from intergovernmental transfers from the federal government. And so we had a huge expansion in that. We collected more revenues from the sales tax. And so we've run really large surpluses for much of the past 8 or 9 years, with the exception maybe of 2020. And so those surpluses have been used to buy down the tax rates or expand the homestead exemption. And yes, it has seemed much like it was a free a free property tax break. But those are revenues that are being collected from either taxpayers here in Texas or, in the case of the federal grants and subsidies, taxpayers in the U.S. So we all know there's no such thing as a free lunch. But overall, I thought your explanation was pretty much spot on.
I mean, as we've sort of continued to say in this conversation, right? Like the money does have to come from
Yeah.
somewhere. School districts, cities, counties do need money to pay for some
Yeah.
things.
So how do you then, like, let's talk specifically about Abbott's plan here,
Yep.
because he rolled out in a press conference, a big event late last year, this sort of idea of, this is going to be my big issue in 2026 as I run for reelection, getting rid of the school property tax. Um, Given all the context of what we just heard and what we just talked about, how possible do you think that is? How do you sort of evaluate this proposal, as this guy's probably going to win
For
re-election?
sure. I shouldn't say for sure. Anything is possible. Don't have a crystal ball, but let me just briefly go through the three main prongs
Okay,
of his
sure.
proposal. So one prong, as we talked about, accounts for sort of the largest chunk of most people's property bills, which is school district taxes.
Mhm.
Abbott wants to allow voters to decide whether to abolish school property taxes on homeowners because he believes the state is collecting enough revenue to sort of backfill that money. Um, they want to make it harder for cities and counties to raise local taxes by requiring a 2/3 vote at the ballot box, which, as one expert that our colleague Josh Fector talked to said, basically, there's no way that would ever pass in most places. So you're really tying people's hands. And then also put a cap on the increase in property values so that your property value cannot increase more than 3% a year in its appraised value. Some of which experts say could work, some of which they say, would likely be a problem, as you sort of alluded to. But yeah, I mean, so what do you, of these, three prongs, John, what do you sort of make of the feasibility, putting aside, honestly, like, the politics of it, just of this effectively lowering people's property tax bills and also continuing to get people the services that they expect?
Well, you could definitely, is it feasible? Let's just start there.
Mhm.
It's absolutely feasible. Um, you know, I mean, I've written a paper on replacing the school M&O property tax, and it could be done. It would require some base broadening on the sales tax side, and a reduction in expenditures to keep the rate below 10%. Um, so,
When
so
you
from
say
a
base
fees,
broadening, do you basically mean like increasing the tax rate?
no, I mean increasing the
The
number of
number.
goods that are subject to the sales tax. So,
Gotcha.
But the age old, the one that comes up is you could tax services like golf lessons
Gotcha.
or other types
You know
of
your
lessons.
audience.
There's a lot of services that are untaxed
Hmm.
that we could include and that would bring in additional revenue
Okay.
at the current rate.
Understood. Yeah.
Um, I have proposed before switching from a sales tax to a value added tax, and actually that this was proposed by Governor Bush back in 1997, I think it was. It didn't last very long politically,
Yeah.
uh, but a value added tax would be a more efficient version of a sales tax. That would both be more efficient on the business side, and it would allow for collecting more, at more stages of the production process. But that's another discussion. So it is feasible. The appraisal cap, I mean, but let's say it is feasible.
Hmm.
Obviously, there are the problems with expanding the sales tax rate too high. Appraisal caps, we know that those are fraught with problems, especially a 3% cap. Would it work to bring down people's taxes? Yes, it would work to bring down some people's taxes. If you buy a house and you stay in it for a long time, you would see a tax reduction. But if you have to sell, or if you're an entrant into the housing market, then your property would reappraise at market value. And so there you would end up with the haves and the have-nots. The haves would be the people that locked in a really low value, and they would get locked into their house, much like people are locked into their houses with low interest rates. So because you have this financial benefit of a really low appraised value, it becomes too expensive to move to a new property. Just like currently, we see people with really low mortgage interest rates, they just can't afford to move out of their house because, going from a $300,000 house with a 2% mortgage rate to a $300,000 house with a 6% mortgage interest rate is not feasible for their budget. And so you get what's called a lock-in effect. Uh, and so all of this is feasible. The problem is it's all from one side. I mean, so we're talking only about the tax side, and and local governments also have a spending side to look at.
Hmm.
And those two things have to align because they have to balance their budgets. And so there is concern over that. Uh, but mainly for me, I mean, the problem on the tax side is that the way we're trying to do this is a little disjointed, and I really think the appraisal caps bring in a lot of inefficient aspects uh, that would uh, you know that would be detrimental to the housing market and for many people in the housing market, although it would benefit a fair number of people that are able to stay in their house for a long time.
Yeah, I think a key point you made there too is right. Like we talk a lot about this of like replacing revenue and everything like that. I'm sure Governor Abbott and other people who would advocate for this plan would say that this is you pay for this three different ways, right? Maybe there's some like tweaks to expanding the base, like you talk about. There's also just the long ongoing economic growth of Texas. You hear folks who have advocated for this talk about that, like Texas has had this economic miracle for decades now, and that can help pay for that too. And then on the other side is of course reductions in spending. You probably can't do this without some kind of spending cuts in these areas too, which when you're talking about schools is a difficult thing to do, and
Well,
can certainly draw blowback. Well,
yeah,
difficult politically, at
Yeah.
least, whether
yeah.
whether
Well,
there is path
I
to
was
come.
gonna throw in something we've seen here in Houston. HISD just put out their uh, uh, data on their school population for this year, and it's down by 8,300 students. That's a 4.7% decrease in the size of their student body. Their student body population has decreased every year since 2015. There's been no uh, decrease in property taxes over that same period. And when we look at the data that's out there right now, and this is, we talk about economic growth a lot, and one thing that everybody is kind of ignoring in the long term which is a really important issue, is the reduction in fertility across the United States, here in Texas, everywhere, in Japan, in Europe, pretty much everywhere in the world except sub-Saharan Africa, birth rates are below the replacement rate, which means populations are going to be shrinking. And so the only way to continue growing the Texas population is to do it through immigration. And given current policies, I think I'm skeptical of how much immigration growth we're going to get in the next 4 years. Because at this point, a lot of the immigration over the last 5 years has been concentrated in international migration. And I think we're going to see a lot less of that. So the only way to increase the population going forward is just going to be through internal US migration. I don't know how much more gas is left in that tank, uh, but I do know at some point, Texas, just like everywhere else in the world, is going to have to deal with and think about how do you plan for a shrinking population, because that is on the 30-year horizon. And when you're thinking about building school buildings and stuff like that, you need to be thinking 30 years out.
Well, of course, I mean, we are talking to you from Austin, where they have been trying to close schools for years, and that has been its own political fight as well. But another example of what you say. But I mean, I guess also presuming that we're talking about population decline, we're also probably talking about decline in other types of revenues, like there's likely a decline in economic growth, or at least a slowing of economic growth there as well, that would affect revenue, you would think, as well. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we've got, I think, an extraordinary amount of detail from Governor Abbott about how he would like to see this play out. We've also heard from Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick with sort of, I think, an agreement on the principle, which is we should find a way to reduce property taxes. Some pretty significant disagreements on how we should do it. Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick has his plan called Operation Double Nickel, which, he who names his plan first, maybe he comes out a little in front. Essentially, which would increase the homestead exemption by another $40,000, and allow people to qualify for the increased exemption you get when you are considered elderly or disabled. Would lower that to age 55, the double nickel of that. And I mean, Lieutenant Governor Patrick has said, like, we can eliminate school property taxes over the coming years. We cannot eliminate all property taxes. We're not likely to eliminate all property taxes and like remain fiscally solvent. So he sort of is ideologically different than Abbott in that regard.
Yeah, and first of all, I feel like we're getting rid of school property taxes has like a bit more of a grab you ring to it than Operation Double Nickel, but
Yes.
we can discuss the
Yeah.
branding later. I do think it's going to be really interesting to watch this from just a political perspective, right? Because the story of 2024 and 2024 elections was Abbott getting behind school vouchers as an issue and really, really asserting his will, so that when the next legislature came in, they were aligned with him. And he had sort of like shown his political strength in saying, we're going to get this through. The difference, of course, between, so now fast forward to 2026, and Abbott is sort of signaling that property taxes, school property tax in general, is like my issue like that as well. The difference between those two issues is that in 2024, he was on the same side as Dan Patrick. Dan Patrick, it was not a coincidence that Patrick called that press conference where he announced Operation Double Nickel, days, if not weeks, after Abbott came out with his own plan, right? They do not seem to be perfectly aligned right here. And how willing are these two to, fight over this is going to be a really fascinating thing to watch over the next, year and a half, basically.
And property taxes are just really complicated. Like, I
Yes.
think it is easier to say, are you in on vouchers? Are you out on vouchers? Versus saying, well, we all agree we want to reduce property taxes. We're all coming in from the same position. How are we going to do it? That's where the splintering happens. And we saw that in 2023. I mean,
Right.
disagreement over property taxes and how to do it really messed up some reporters' summer plans.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
I don't think, the nuance of how this gets done is going to be very wonky, very in the weeds, and leave a lot of daylight between people who are like otherwise pretty ideologically aligned.
Yeah, and one of the things that they fought over, this was Dade Phelan and Dan Patrick fighting back in 2023. One of the things they fought over was capping property values, right? And Dan Patrick was very passionately, the nickname California Dade is a reference to the fact that California has property value caps, and a lot of people blame that, as John was kind of referring somewhat earlier to. A lot of people blame that on the extremely high housing values in California, on that incentive to sort of stay inside your house. And so are we going to get a California Greg in 2027? It'll be interesting to see.
And I
Yeah.
think, yeah.
When I think back on that, I mean, so to think about the lieutenant governor's plan, how I like to state it is it's not really a lot different. So you've got the double nickel portion. Well, all that does is freeze people's property values when they turn 55. So it's basically a redistribution of the property tax burden from people that are 55 and older to people that are 55 and younger. And that's similar, not exactly, but it's similar to what you get under appraisal cap. You also get the lock-in effect for people then that are 55 and older. So they both redistribute property taxes to the younger generation. That they both cause some extent of a lock-in effect. One depending on how long you've been in your house, and one depending on your age. Once you turn 55, it's not quite as powerful as the 3% cap, but it is there. The thing I like about the lieutenant governor's plan is that he did include a 3.5% cap on spending. So he just didn't attack the tax side. He also brought in a proposal to limit growth on the spending side. And I think spending limits, such as Colorado's spending limit that they've imposed, has been much more successful at reducing the growth of the local government sector relative to appraisal caps, which I don't think have been all that effective in reducing growth. And similar, the homestead exemptions that we've passed in the last 10 years, as well as the compression of the property tax rate that have been passed in several sessions, those haven't done much to contain the growth of the local government sector either. So I think the one great thing, or the one thing I was pleased to see in Operation Double Nickel, was at least some attention paid to both the tax and the spending side, instead of looking solely at the tax side.
Yeah. And I'm largely joking about California Greg. I do not anticipate Dan Patrick pulling out that nickname,
Don't
but
give anybody any ideas.
I think it is an interesting thing. People have watched the delicate dance between Greg Abbott and Dan Patrick for years, and how well do they get along? How much willing are they to work together? I'm not sure we have. And in that 2023 fight, there was, I think, frustration from both the speaker and the lieutenant governor about whether Abbott should be being more vocal and sort of pointing the direction that he wants. And
Yeah.
how they figure that out will be interesting.
Another, yeah, another issue that was raised in that really by Dave Phelan was that, one of the biggest problems with all of these solutions is that, and I wrote a paper on this, so that in 23, there was the 20% cap on non-homestead properties valued under $5 million. And what you saw in that was that when you cap something like that, any cap, all it does is shift taxes somewhere else. And this is true for expansions of the homestead exemption as well. And so what we've been seeing in much of the last 10 years is just a shifting of the property tax burden from households to businesses. And I don't think that's a sustainable way to reduce property taxes. And so at some point, we're going to have some better plans than what our politicians are trying to sell us. But for now, this is the best we have.
And I think there will eventually be political pushback in Texas to continuing to put burden on businesses that
Correct.
you're not putting on individuals. Well, I think it is clear that this is going to be the issue of the year, the issue of next year, the issue of probably the next decade of Texans' lives. But certainly something we are going to continue to dig in on. John, thank you so much for joining us this week on TribCast. We appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
You can find TribCast anywhere you get your podcasts. Our theme music is by Rob and Chris, who are also our producers. And we will see you next week.